The check changed their lives. The joke changed mine. My name is Margaret Bennett, and at 71 years old, I thought I understood the difference between generosity and gratitude. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can trace everything to a single piece of paper I signed 8 years ago. At the time, my son Ryan and his wife Ashley were struggling. They had found a house they loved in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. It was not extravagant, just a modest family home with a fenced backyard and enough room for the children they hoped to have someday. The problem was the down payment. Interest rates were rising, their savings were falling short, and the deal seemed destined to collapse. I still remember Ryan sitting at my kitchen table with his head in his hands. He looked exhausted. Ashley sat beside him, trying to stay optimistic, but I could see the worry in her eyes. As a mother, seeing your child in pain never becomes easier, no matter how old they are. At that time, I had already been retired for several years. I lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. Most of my savings came from decades of careful planning and the life insurance money my late husband had left behind. That money represented security. It represented stability. It represented the future I had worked hard to protect. Yet when I looked at Ryan, I did not see numbers. I saw my son. 2 days later, I wrote the check. It was the largest financial gift I had ever given anyone. I never asked for repayment. I never requested recognition. I simply wanted to help them build a better life. When Ryan and Ashley received the money, they were overwhelmed with gratitude. Ashley hugged me so tightly that afternoon I could barely breathe. She thanked me repeatedly and called me an angel. Ryan promised he would never forget what I had done for them. For a while, I believed him. Over the years, my support continued. I babysat when daycare costs became overwhelming. I helped during medical emergencies. I watched the grandchildren whenever schedules became complicated. Sometimes I brought groceries. Sometimes I paid for unexpected repairs. Other times I simply listened when life became difficult. None of it felt like a burden. Family helps family. At least that was the belief I carried for most of my life. The house became a symbol of their success. Birthday parties filled the backyard. Holiday dinners crowded the dining room. School photographs lined the walls. Every time I visited, I felt proud knowing I had played a small part in helping them create that life. Yet something subtle began changing as the years passed. The thank yous became less frequent. The appreciation became quieter. Gradually, the sacrifices that once seemed extraordinary became expected. At first, I dismissed the feeling. People get busy. Life becomes complicated. Not every act of kindness requires constant acknowledgement. That was what I told myself. Then one evening, during a family gathering at their house, I noticed something that left an uneasy feeling in my chest. It was not an argument. It was not a confrontation. It was simply a look exchanged between Ashley and another relative after someone mentioned how much I had helped over the years. The smile on Ashley's face lasted only a second, but there was something behind it that I could not quite explain. At the time, I ignored it. A few weeks later, I would hear something from the other side of a kitchen door that would force me to see everything differently. Over the next several weeks, I found myself thinking about that look more often than I wanted to admit. It would appear unexpectedly while I was grocery shopping, watering flowers on my front porch, or folding laundry in the quiet house I had shared with my late husband for more than 40 years. Every time it surfaced in my memory, I told myself the same thing. I was overthinking it. Ashley had always been expressive. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe there was nothing there at all. Life continued as usual. Ryan called when he needed advice. Ashley texted when she needed help with the grandchildren. I drove across town several times each month to babysit, attend school events, and help with whatever challenge happened to appear that week. If a child became sick, I adjusted my schedule. If someone needed transportation, I offered it. If an unexpected bill arrived, I sometimes quietly helped without telling anyone else. None of those decisions felt extraordinary to me. They felt natural. That was how I had always approached family. The strange thing was that the more I gave, the less noticeable the giving seemed to become. What had once been met with gratitude gradually became treated as routine. One Saturday afternoon, Ashley called asking if I could watch the children for the entire weekend because she and Ryan wanted a short getaway. I agreed immediately. The grandchildren were a joy, and spending time with them never felt like work. When they returned Sunday evening, both children were fed, happy, and ready for school the next morning. Ashley thanked me briefly before discussing restaurant reservations they had enjoyed during their trip. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes. Not once did she ask whether the weekend had been difficult or whether I needed anything. I remember driving home afterward feeling slightly unsettled. Not angry, just invisible. Similar moments began appearing everywhere. During family dinners, stories about sacrifices and support somehow focused on everyone except the people providing it. During birthdays and holidays, gifts and efforts were accepted warmly but quickly forgotten. The appreciation I once felt seemed to have faded into expectation. The most troubling part was how gradually it happened. If someone had treated me poorly from the beginning, I would have recognized it immediately. Instead, the change occurred so slowly that I barely noticed it happening. Then came the evening that changed everything. Ryan and Ashley hosted a family gathering to celebrate their youngest daughter's 10th birthday. Relatives filled the house. Children ran through hallways carrying balloons and slices of cake. Music played softly in the background while adults gathered in small groups throughout the living room and kitchen. At one point, I stepped away from the crowd to place a serving tray in the kitchen. As I approached the doorway, I heard voices on the other side. Ashley was speaking with another relative. I had no intention of listening. In fact, I almost announced my presence immediately. Then I heard my name. I stopped. The relative mentioned how fortunate Ryan and Ashley were to have so much support from me over the years. There was a short pause. Then Ashley laughed. Not politely, not awkwardly, genuinely laughed. What she said next froze me in place. Honestly, she said, if someone is willing to keep giving, why would you tell them to stop? The two women laughed together. In that moment, something inside me shifted. And what I heard next was even worse. For a moment, I stood perfectly still outside that kitchen doorway, hoping I had misunderstood what I had heard. People say strange things in casual conversations. Sometimes jokes sound worse when taken out of context. I wanted to believe that was true. Then Ashley continued speaking. The relative asked whether she ever felt uncomfortable accepting so much help from me. Ashley laughed again. Not really, she said. Margaret likes being needed. Honestly, helping us gives her something to do. More laughter followed. The words themselves were not cruel. That was what made them so painful. They reduced years of sacrifice to a hobby. They transformed countless acts of love into a convenient personality trait. I remained where I was for several seconds, staring at the tray in my hands. Part of me wanted to walk into the kitchen and confront her immediately. Another part knew that doing so would accomplish nothing. Ashley would apologize. She would explain. She would tell everyone I had misunderstood. So instead, I quietly returned the tray to a nearby table and stepped outside onto the back patio. The evening air felt cooler than before. Children were still laughing in the yard. Family members were still celebrating. Nothing around me had changed. Yet everything felt different. For the first time, I found myself looking backward through the years with a new perspective. Memories I had always viewed as kindness suddenly looked different. I remembered the emergency furnace repair I paid for one winter when Ryan and Ashley were struggling financially. I remembered postponing a vacation so I could help cover unexpected medical expenses. I remembered spending weeks caring for the grandchildren. While both parents worked long hours, none of those choices felt wrong. I would probably make them again if it truly helped someone I loved. The painful realization was not that I had been generous. The painful realization was that my generosity had become invisible. As the evening continued, I watched Ashley move comfortably through the crowd. She smiled. She chatted with relatives. She thanked guests for coming. To everyone around her, she looked exactly like the warm and appreciative daughter-in-law I thought I knew. Several times, she even came outside to check whether I was enjoying myself. The contrast was difficult to process. How could someone sound so grateful in public and so dismissive in private? By the time I drove home that night, my thoughts were tangled with doubt. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe Ashley had simply made a careless comment. Ryan certainly would not approve if he knew how it sounded. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. That uncertainty followed me for days. Every phone call felt different. Every family interaction carried an uncomfortable weight. When Ashley asked if I could watch the grandchildren later that week, I agreed as usual. Yet for the first time, I noticed something missing. There was no appreciation, no acknowledgement of the time being requested, only expectation. The assumption that I would say yes because I always had. One afternoon, while helping my oldest granddaughter Emma with a school project at the dining room table, She asked an innocent question. She wanted to know whether I ever got tired of helping everyone. I smiled and told her families take care of each other. Emma nodded thoughtfully before saying something unexpected. Sometimes it feels like people forget how much you do. The room suddenly felt very quiet. And for the second time in less than a week, someone else had noticed what I was only beginning to understand myself. Emma's comment stayed with me long after she left that afternoon. Children often notice things adults overlook because they have not yet learned how to explain away uncomfortable truths. For days, I found myself replaying her words in my mind. Sometimes it feels like people forget how much you do. The more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the pattern forming around me. What made everything even more confusing was that nobody openly treated me badly. There were no arguments, no dramatic confrontations, no obvious cruelty. Instead, there was something much more difficult to address. There was entitlement, the assumption that my time, energy, and resources would always be available whenever someone needed them. A week later, Ryan called asking if I could help with another situation. One of the children needed transportation to several after-school activities because both parents had scheduling conflicts. I agreed immediately, just as I always had. Over the next several days, I spent nearly 12 hours driving back and forth across town. I packed snacks, helped with homework, and rearranged my own appointments to make everything work smoothly. Not once did I complain. Yet when the week ended, the entire arrangement seemed to disappear into the background as though it had happened automatically. During a family dinner that weekend, everyone discussed busy schedules and stressful responsibilities. Several people talked about how difficult the week had been. Listening to the conversation, I realized nobody had mentioned the person who made those schedules possible. Again, I told myself not to take it personally, but the feeling lingered. Around the same time, I decided to speak with Ryan privately. I did not mention the conversation I had overheard. I simply asked whether he ever worried that I was taking on too much. His response surprised me. Ryan smiled and told me I had always enjoyed helping. According to him, staying involved gave me purpose. The words sounded harmless, yet they echoed Ashley's comment almost perfectly. Helping us gives her something to do. For a moment, I wondered whether they both truly believed that. Had years of sacrifice become so normal that nobody recognized them anymore? Had generosity been mistaken for obligation? After that conversation, I became more observant. Instead of immediately volunteering, I waited. Instead of rushing to solve problems, I listened. What I noticed was revealing. Requests arrived constantly. Could I watch the children? Could I pick someone up? Could I help cover an expense until next month? Could I rearrange my plans to accommodate someone else's emergency? Rarely did anyone ask how I was doing before asking for help. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. Then something unexpected happened. One evening, while attending my granddaughter Emma's school concert, I found myself seated beside my sister-in-law Diane. We chatted casually while waiting for the performance to begin. At some point, the conversation turned toward family. Diane hesitated before speaking, as though debating whether she should say anything at all. Then she admitted she had noticed how frequently people relied on me. More importantly, she admitted she sometimes worried that my kindness was being taken for granted. Hearing those words from another adult affected me more than I expected. Emma had noticed. Now Diane had too. Suddenly the doubt I had been carrying began to weaken. Perhaps I was not imagining things after all. Perhaps the problem was not my sensitivity. Perhaps the problem was that everyone had become comfortable receiving while forgetting how much was being given. And as that realization settled into place, another question began forming in my mind. If Ashley could laugh about my generosity in private, what else was she saying when she thought nobody important was listening? After my conversation with Diane, I stopped dismissing my concerns as imagination. I did not become bitter. I did not start keeping score. Instead, I paid attention. For years, I had focused so much on helping that I rarely stopped to evaluate what was happening around me. Now, for the first time, I allowed myself to observe without immediately creating excuses for everyone else. The difference was remarkable. Once you recognize a pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee it. Over the following month, several situations unfolded that reinforced what I was beginning to understand. One afternoon, Ashley called asking whether I could watch the children on short notice because she had made plans with friends. I already had an appointment scheduled with my doctor. When I explained that I was unavailable, there was a brief silence on the phone. Then Ashley sighed. It was a small sound, barely noticeable, but it carried disappointment rather than understanding. She quickly recovered and said she would figure something out. The conversation ended politely. Yet after hanging up, I realized something troubling. For years, I had rearranged my life whenever someone needed me. The first time I said no, the response felt less like appreciation and more like inconvenience. A week later, another moment caught my attention. Ryan and Ashley hosted a barbecue for friends and family. The backyard was full of conversation and laughter. As guests mingled around the patio, several people complimented the house and mentioned how fortunate the family had been to purchase it when they did. Listening from across the yard, I heard Ashley proudly describe how hard they had worked to build their life together. There was nothing wrong with that statement. They had worked hard, but not once did she mention the help that made the purchase possible in the first place. Again, I told myself that recognition was not the goal of generosity. Yet I could not ignore the growing feeling that history itself was being quietly rewritten. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. Emma joined me on the back porch while everyone else remained inside. She looked hesitant, the way someone looks when deciding whether to share information they are not sure they should reveal. Eventually, she told me she had overheard a conversation between Ashley and one of her friends a few days earlier. Emma had not intended to listen. She simply happened to be nearby when my name came up. My stomach tightened immediately. Emma explained that the friend had commented on how helpful I was. According to her, Ashley laughed and replied that having a generous mother-in-law was one of the best investments a person could make. The friend laughed. Ashley laughed. Then they changed the subject. Emma looked uncomfortable repeating the story. I thanked her for telling me. After she left, I sat alone on the porch for nearly an hour. The words themselves were not devastating. What mattered was the attitude behind them. Investments produce returns. Relationships should not. For the first time, I began wondering whether Ashley viewed my support as something entirely different from what I had intended. That evening, another memory surfaced. Several months earlier, I had accidentally walked into a conversation just as it ended. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I found myself reconsidering every detail. The smiles, the assumptions, the confidence. Slowly, a larger picture was emerging. And the more complete that picture became, the more one question demanded an answer. Was Ashley merely taking my generosity for granted, or had she already started planning her future around resources she believed would always belong to her? The question stayed with me for days. I did not obsess over it, but I could not ignore it either. Once certain ideas enter your mind, they begin connecting themselves to memories you had previously dismissed. Looking back, I realized there had been countless small clues scattered throughout the years. At the time, each one seemed harmless. Together, however, they were beginning to tell a very different story. A few weeks after the barbecue, Ryan and Ashley invited me to dinner. It was a casual evening, the kind of family gathering that had once made me feel comfortable and appreciated. The grandchildren were excited to show me school projects. Ryan talked about work. Ashley discussed renovations they hoped to make to the house. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Then the conversation drifted toward long-term plans. One of the children asked whether the family would ever move to a larger home. Ryan laughed and said they were happy where they were. Before anyone else could respond, Ashley smiled and said that future opportunities had a way of appearing when people least expected them. The comment seemed innocent enough, yet something about the way she said it caught my attention. A few minutes later, she casually mentioned that families often build wealth across generations and that smart people know how to prepare for the future. Again, nobody reacted. Why would they? It sounded like ordinary conversation. But I found myself remembering Emma's story. I found myself remembering the laughter behind the kitchen door. I found myself noticing details I would once have ignored. Over the next month, several similar conversations occurred. Whenever discussions involved retirement, property, savings, or inheritance, Ashley seemed unusually interested. She often asked questions that sounded practical on the surface. Had I considered downsizing? Was maintaining my house becoming difficult? Did I have plans for the future of the property? None of those questions were inappropriate by themselves. Yet their frequency felt increasingly noticeable. The most revealing moment arrived unexpectedly. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by the house to drop off a birthday gift for one of the grandchildren. The front door was unlocked, and I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. I had every intention of announcing myself immediately. Then I heard Ashley speaking. She was talking with a friend. Once again, my name came up. I did not hear the beginning of the conversation. I only heard the part that followed. Ashley was discussing future plans and financial security. Then she made a comment that finally answered the question I had been carrying for weeks. She said that eventually everything would work itself out because family resources always stay within the family. Her friend asked what she meant. Ashley laughed and replied that some people spent their entire lives accumulating assets only to leave them behind anyway. The statement was followed by another laugh. Not cruel, not angry, simply confident. That confidence told me more than the words themselves ever could. Standing in the hallway, I felt something unexpected. Not heartbreak, clarity. For the first time, I understood that Ashley did not see my generosity as a gift. She saw it as a resource. Something predictable, something permanent, something she had already incorporated into her expectations about the future. Quietly, I stepped back outside before either woman noticed me. During the drive home, I thought about every sacrifice I had made. The check, the babysitting, the emergencies, the countless times I had prioritized their needs above my own. None of those choices suddenly became mistakes. What changed was my understanding of how they were being perceived. And as I pulled into my driveway that evening, I realized something important. The problem was no longer whether Ashley appreciated my generosity. The problem was that she had begun treating it as something she already owned. Once I understood what was really happening, my perspective began to change. Not overnight, not dramatically. Years of habit do not disappear in a single afternoon. For most of my life, helping others had been part of who I was. Saying yes came naturally. Creating boundaries did not. Yet after hearing Ashley's assumptions about the future, I realized something important. Continuing exactly as I had before would only reinforce the belief that my generosity existed to serve everyone else's expectations. For the first time, I decided to make small changes. Nothing cruel, nothing punitive, simply healthy limits. When requests arrived, I stopped answering immediately. Instead of automatically rearranging my schedule, I considered my own commitments first. If I already had plans, I kept them. If I was tired, I allowed myself to rest. The reactions were revealing. The first few times, people seemed surprised. Ryan asked whether everything was all right because I had declined a last-minute babysitting request. Ashley sounded confused when I told her I could not spend an entire weekend helping with a home project because I already had plans with friends. Nobody became angry. That was not the issue. The issue was that they seemed genuinely shocked I might have priorities of my own. Several weeks later, the family gathered for Ryan and Ashley's 15th wedding anniversary celebration. The event was held at a local country club outside Columbus. Friends, relatives, and neighbors filled the banquet room. Decorations lined the walls. Music played softly in the background. It was the kind of occasion designed to celebrate family, commitment, and shared memories. As I walked into the room that evening, I immediately noticed how comfortable Ashley appeared. She moved confidently from table to table, greeting guests and accepting compliments. Watching her, I found myself remembering the young woman who had once hugged me with tears in her eyes after receiving help with the down payment on the house. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had transformed into certainty. During dinner, several relatives shared stories about Ryan and Ashley's life together. People spoke about challenges they had overcome and milestones they had achieved. The atmosphere remained warm and positive. Then one of Ashley's friends stood and joked about how fortunate the couple had been to have support whenever life became difficult. The comment drew laughter and nods from around the room. What happened next changed everything. Ashley laughed too. Then she casually replied that having generous family members made life much easier. The room chuckled politely. Under normal circumstances, the moment might have passed unnoticed. This time, however, I saw something different. Several people exchanged glances. Diane looked down at her plate. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Even Ryan's smile seemed uncertain. For months, perhaps years, everyone had been collecting small pieces of the same puzzle. Now those pieces were beginning to connect. Ashley seemed completely unaware of it. She continued telling stories and accepting congratulations. The confidence in her voice never wavered. Yet as the evening progressed, I noticed more people paying attention. More people listening carefully. More people remembering things they had once ignored. The atmosphere had not become hostile. It had become observant. There is a significant difference. Near the end of the dinner, Another relative mentioned how fortunate Ryan and Ashley were to have people willing to sacrifice for them. Once again, Ashley smiled. Once again, she responded with the easy confidence of someone who believed her audience agreed with her. What she did not realize was that the audience had already started seeing something entirely different. And before the evening was over, that realization was about to become impossible to ignore. As the anniversary dinner continued, the mood in the room remained pleasant on the surface. Guests chatted between courses. Glasses clinked softly. Music drifted through the banquet hall. Yet beneath the celebration, something had shifted. More people were listening than speaking now. More people were observing. Ashley still seemed completely unaware of the change. She continued moving confidently from conversation to conversation, comfortable in the belief that everyone viewed her exactly as she viewed herself. The problem was that confidence often becomes dangerous when it is built on assumptions. Near the end of the evening, several relatives gathered around one of the larger tables to share memories about family milestones. Stories flowed naturally from one person to another. Someone mentioned the early years of Ryan and Ashley's marriage. Another relative recalled the challenges they faced when trying to purchase their first home. Eventually, the conversation reached the subject everyone in the family already knew: the down payment. The room grew quieter as people remembered that period. One cousin smiled and commented that things might have turned out very differently if certain family members had not stepped in to help. Before anyone else could respond, Ashley laughed softly and shook her head. "Well," she said, "sometimes people enjoy being the hero of the story." The comment hung in the air longer than she intended. Several faces immediately changed. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal surprise. For years, many people had heard pieces of the same story. They knew about the financial help. They knew about the babysitting. They knew about the countless sacrifices. Hearing those contributions reduced to a desire for attention sounded different now. Very different. Across the room, Emma looked down at the table. Diane slowly folded her hands together. Even Ryan seemed uncomfortable. Ashley noticed the reaction and quickly tried to laugh it off. She explained that she was joking. Under other circumstances, that explanation might have worked. But the room had reached a point where too many small moments were already connected. The joke behind the kitchen door. The comments about generosity. The assumptions about future resources. The subtle dismissals. People may ignore one incident. They rarely ignore a pattern forever. Then something happened that Ashley clearly did not expect. Diane spoke. Calmly. Respectfully. She simply said that generosity should never be treated as a personality flaw. No accusation followed. No argument. Just a statement. Another relative quietly agreed. A cousin added that not everyone would have made the sacrifices that had been made over the years. The conversation remained polite, but the direction had changed completely. For the first time all evening, Ashley was no longer controlling the narrative. She attempted to explain herself. She insisted she appreciated everything that had been done for the family. The problem was that appreciation sounds different when people have already witnessed repeated evidence to the contrary. One by one, small observations emerged. Not attacks. Observations. Someone mentioned how often help had been expected. Another person recalled situations where gratitude seemed absent. Emma eventually spoke as well. She did not repeat private conversations. She simply described how frequently she had seen generosity treated as something automatic rather than something valuable. The effect was immediate. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody embarrassed anyone. The truth was doing enough on its own. Sitting quietly at my table, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because Ashley was uncomfortable. Not because anyone was taking my side. Relief because the burden of carrying the truth alone had finally disappeared. The room was no longer seeing isolated moments. It was seeing the entire picture. And as Ashley looked around at faces that no longer reflected automatic agreement, she was beginning to realize that the image she had carefully maintained for years was slipping away faster than she could stop it. The days following the anniversary dinner were surprisingly quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations. No angry phone calls. No family members choosing sides. Real life rarely resolves itself that way. Instead, there was something much more powerful. Awareness. Once people see a pattern clearly, they cannot force themselves to unsee it. Conversations became more thoughtful. Assumptions were questioned. Expectations that had once gone unnoticed suddenly felt visible to everyone involved. A week after the celebration, Ryan asked if we could meet for lunch. We sat together at a small restaurant we had visited many times over the years. For several minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. Work, family, the grandchildren. Then his expression grew more serious. He admitted that the anniversary dinner had forced him to think about several things he had ignored for a long time. He told me he had spent years assuming everyone appreciated my support because he appreciated it himself. What he never realized was that appreciation means very little if it is never expressed. Listening to him speak, I saw a genuine reflection rather than defensiveness. For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. We talked openly about family dynamics, expectations, and boundaries. I explained that helping had never been the problem. The problem was feeling valued only when I was providing something. Ryan nodded slowly. By the end of lunch, he understood. More importantly, he wanted to do better. Ashley never offered a dramatic apology. In truth, I did not expect one. What changed instead was her behavior. Requests became less frequent. Assumptions became less obvious. Gratitude appeared where entitlement had once existed. The transformation was not immediate, and it was certainly not perfect. But it was noticeable. For perhaps the first time, she understood that generosity is not an endless resource that exists for someone else's convenience. It is a choice, a gift, something that deserves respect. Around the same time, I made several decisions of my own. I stopped organizing my life around everyone else's emergencies. I took a long postponed trip with friends. I joined a local book club. I spent more time pursuing interests I had neglected for years. To my surprise, the world did not fall apart. The family adapted. Problems were solved. Responsibilities were shared more evenly. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes people only recognize the value of what you provide after they experience life without unlimited access to it. Several months later, I attended another family gathering. The atmosphere felt different from the moment I arrived. Not because people treated me like a hero. That was never what I wanted. The difference was respect. Genuine respect. Family members asked about my plans. They listened to my opinions. They thanked me when I helped. Most importantly, nobody acted as though my generosity belonged to them. As the evening came to an end, Emma joined me on the back porch. She was older now than when this story began, yet she still possessed the same quiet wisdom that had first helped me recognize the truth. We watched the sunset for a few minutes before she asked whether I regretted everything I had done for the family. The question deserved an honest answer. I smiled and shook my head. No, I did not regret the sacrifices. I did not regret the check. I did not regret the years of support. Those actions reflected my character, not theirs. The mistake was never generosity. The mistake was believing generosity alone could teach gratitude. Some lessons must be learned differently. As the sky darkened above us, I thought about everything that had happened. The laughter behind the kitchen door, the assumptions, the disappointment, the clarity that followed. In the end, I did not need revenge. I did not need recognition. I only needed the truth to be seen clearly. Because the day I stopped allowing my generosity to be taken for granted was the day everyone finally understood its value.